My topic tonight is what goes around comes around. Americans interpret the Lincoln assassination. And we all know what goes around comes around is a saying familiar to most Americans. Some people might conclude that it is an appropriate way to summarize the status of research into the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. A close examination reveals that there is a circular wheel-like motion to the manner in which Americans have interpreted the death of the 16th president. When John Wilkes Booth shot the president at Ford's Theater in April 1865, it was hardly a great leap of imagination for Northerners to conclude that the Confederates were the sinister force behind the murder. After all, the assassin, who was a well-known Southern actor, had shouted "Sic Semper Tyrannis," the motto of the state of Virginia, but had he said nothing, suspicion would still have fallen upon the South. Navy Secretary Gideon Welles, on learning of the shooting, reacted with uncharacteristic profanity, "Damn the rebels, this is their work." At least Mrs. Welles said it was uncharacteristic profanity. At the conclusion of the Civil War, which historians now estimate cost some 750,000 deaths, there was nothing more natural than for the public to believe that the president's assassination was a last desperate act of the Confederacy. Since Lincoln was shot on Good Friday, April 14th, 1865, and the anniversary, of course, is coming up here shortly, and died the next morning, many mourners compared the martyred president to Moses, who did not reach the promised land, or even Jesus. Tens of thousands of mourners attended memorial services on Easter Sunday, hoping that their clergymen might explain and help them comprehend this national tragedy. Many sermons reinforced the idea of Southern involvement. In a typical sermon, the Reverend W.H. Bernard told his congregation, "And thus did the rebellion prove itself by its lone last act to have been all a murder, clothed in the dark and filthy rags of a lie, the very child and image of him who was a murderer and liar from the beginning." Since there was a simultaneous assault on Secretary Seward, which left his home a bloody shambles and Seward himself badly injured, as well as rumors of a man lurking about Vice President Johnson's hotel, authorities had no way of knowing how widespread the plot was. One can imagine that if a similar bloody scene unfolded today, the public would hardly see it as the work of a few lone individuals, but rather as the act of some terrorist or radical group. Many people also exhibited a strong desire to impose vengeance upon anyone who sympathized with Booth's deed. Outside Ford's Theater on April 14th, there were calls to burn the building, while one man who said, "I'm glad it happened," had most of his clothes torn from his body and was only rescued by 3 police officers with guns drawn as he was being hustled to a nearby lamppost. Probably no more dramatic event occurred than that recorded by Melville Stone, the general manager of the Associated Press. "I made my way around the corner to the Madison House. Very soon I heard the crack of a revolver and a man fell in the center of the room. His assailant stood perfectly composed with a smoking revolver in his hand and justified his action by saying, 'He said it served Lincoln right. There was no arrest. No one would have dared arrest the man. He walked out a hero. I never knew who he was.'" And that's really kind of an astounding image there, that you can shoot somebody and walk out of the room to sort of polite applause. Historians have unearthed over 200 violent acts, including one individual who was thrown to his death in the paddle wheel of the Brooklyn Ferry for a similar alleged utterance. However, over the course of the next 150 years, suspicion shifted to other suspects, the first being Andrew Johnson, during the radicals' attempt to impeach the president and to remove him from office, and then in the 20th century to the radical Republicans themselves. Finally, the wheel made a complete circle when William Tidwell, David Gaddy, and James Hall argued in the book Come Retribution, The Confederate Secret Service and the Death of Lincoln, that the Confederates actually had been behind plans to kidnap Lincoln and then to kill him, although they were not directly involved in Booth's assassination plan. A brief survey of the manner in which historians have treated the assassination brings this circular motion into sharper focus. After a massive manhunt, Booth was tracked down and killed in Garrett's Barn on April 26, 1865, and 8 alleged co-conspirators were arrested and tried before a military commission. The guilt of several of the accused seemed a foregone conclusion. Lewis Powell had attacked Secretary of State William Seward and members of his household. David Herold had been found with Booth in Garrett's Barn, and George Atzerodt admitted that the assassin had signed him to kill Vice President Johnson, but he had lost his nerve. Powell's lawyer even argued that it was his client's Southern background that had caused him to become involved in the plot, a sort of environmental insanity. Such an assertion produced an unfavorable impression before the military court, and the conviction and execution of the trio was hardly surprising. 3 other plotters, Michael O'Laughlin, Samuel Arnold, and Edmund Spangler, were perceived by the military tribunal to be less clearly involved in the murder, although deeply connected with Booth's attempt to capture the president and exchange him for Confederate prisoners. Therefore, O'Laughlin and Arnold were sentenced to life in prison, while Spangler received a 6-year sentence as an accessory, his major offense being that he had been asked to hold Booth's horse. Whatever the trial revealed about the guilt or innocence of the specific conspirators, it reinforced the idea that just like Booth, they were supporters of secession and tools of the Confederacy. Arnold, O'Laughlin, and Powell all served in the Confederate Army, although Arnold was discharged after the First Battle of Bull Run due to illness, and O'Laughlin left the service in June of 1862. Powell fought at Gettysburg and was captured before breaking his parole and residing in Baltimore for a time. George Atzerodt was a blockade runner who ferried agents and supplies across the Potomac River. Very few people had any doubts why these individuals would be involved in efforts to either kidnap or kill Abraham Lincoln. The cases of 2 other accused, Mary Surratt and Samuel Mudd, have always been much more controversial. Defenders of Mrs. Surratt have portrayed her as the innocent victim of plots in which her son was involved, while supporters of Dr. Mudd see him as having been arrested for setting Booth's leg, as any doctor might have done. Recent scholarship, including George Atzerodt's lost confession that surfaced in the papers of his attorney, William Doster, and Edward Steer's book and study of the Mudd case, called with a clever title, His Name is Still Mudd, the case against Dr. Samuel Alexander Mudd, have provided evidence that Samuel Mudd was involved to capture in the plan to capture Lincoln, although his involvement in the murder is a lot less clear. Kate Larson titled her recent study of Mrs. Surratt, The Assassin's Accomplice, and argues that Mary Surratt was intimately involved with Booth's plotting and perhaps even deserved the death penalty for her actions. Like other conspirators, there were no doubts about Surratt and Mudd's Southern loyalties. Both families were slave owners. In fact, the Mudds were one of the largest slave-owning families in Maryland. Dr. Mudd certainly looked on emancipation as destroying his family's livelihood, although the Emancipation Proclamation did not immediately apply to Maryland, which had remained in the Union. Mudd was also apparently involved in the Confederate underground activities and lied to authorities about the number of times that he had met with Booth in Maryland. Mary Surratt's son John was a Confederate courier and blockade runner, and her son Isaac served in the Confederate Army in Texas. R.A. Watts, in a 1922 article, skillfully captured the dilemma faced by the defendants. Quote, "What a boon to Arnold, Spangler, and Mudd would a fair reputation for loyalty have been." While the public paid attention to the cases of the individual conspirators, many people were equally fascinated by testimony concerning alleged Confederate involvement in the assassination. And it's an interesting phenomenon because there's actually, if you go back and look at the trial testimony, more of that type of testimony than there is testimony against the individuals who were on trial. A considerable number of witnesses testified about Southern atrocities, such as mistreatment of prisoners, poisoning of water supplies, and spreading of yellow fever to northern cities. In fact, one of the major reasons that the conspiracy trial was held before a military court was that it allowed this wide-ranging evidence to be introduced. The court functioned almost like a Warren Commission that was determined to unravel the workings of a larger conspiracy. As the Boston Evening Transcript said on June 23rd, it is now abundantly proved that a court confined within strictly legal bounds and never traveling out of the narrow limits of merely technical investigation could not have developed the full extent of the hideous plot. To some contemporaries, as well as historians, the unfairness of the military court was reinforced in 1867 when John Surratt was captured in Alexandria, Egypt, and returned to the United States for trial. Since he was retried in a civil court on the same evidence on which his mother was convicted and the jury could not agree about his guilt, it was easy to portray the 1865 trial as a horrible miscarriage of justice. In reality, the military commission was not as harsh as often portrayed. It only imposed the death penalty on 4 defendants who, even to this day, appear to most historians, to be guilty. And there is no guarantee that a civil jury aroused by Lincoln's death would have been any more lenient. In reality, there were more subtle forces at work in 1867, including the fact that public indignation had cooled somewhat over the course of the past 2 years. In this atmosphere, the case against John Surratt proved to be less than overwhelming. While newspaper editorials expressed belief in Surratt's guilt after the prosecution evidence was presented, once the defense testimony started, the case began to fall apart. Severe doubt was cast as to whether Surratt was even in Washington on April 14th. He apparently was in upstate New York. He was on a mission for the Confederates. And years later, one of the prosecutors, Edward Carrington, admitted that his guilt had not been proven. When the jury could not reach a verdict, the public seemed more than willing to leave the task of unraveling the case to the historians. So I think it's pretty obvious that it's not just the difference between military and civil trial, but I think really a couple of years of cooling off and the circumstances in which both were held. As early as 1867, another subtle shift can be observed. The radical Republicans, as they attempted to gather evidence to impeach Andrew Johnson and remove him from office, began to hint that Lincoln's successor might have been involved in the murder. The enigmatic card that Booth left in Vice President Johnson's box, "Don't wish to disturb you, are you at home?" was now seen as proof of Johnson's complicity. And if you think about it and look at many, if not most, American assassinations, it almost inevitably, there is some suspicion cast on the vice president, because who benefits most? He's the person that is going to take over. It's nonsense, but it's not unusual that should happen. The radical Republicans even formed a congressional committee with Benjamin Butler as its chair to gather evidence, and some testimony was taken from the convicted conspirators who were now incarcerated at Fort Jefferson in the Dry Tortugas. While nothing came of this investigation, it is not unusual, as I've just said, in a sensational case, for the suspicion to center on the vice president. And I cite just one, but I think it illustrates it. There have been similar allegations that Lyndon Johnson was involved in the death of John Kennedy. If you look on the website, Amazon.com, there is a book by an author, Roger Stone, titled "The Man Who Killed Kennedy, The Case Against LBJ," which was released in July of 2013 and was apparently designed to coincide with the 50th anniversary of the Kennedy assassination. Now, you know how on Amazon there are ratings of books and so forth. Uh, 391 people at one point, when I looked on that website, had purchased this book and rated it on Amazon. 244, astonishingly, gave it 5 stars. And I would say if you give a work like that 5 stars, you are apparently firmly convinced that Lyndon Johnson played a leading role in his predecessor's death. I can't explain any other way how one could rate a book like that highly, unless they had that held that point of view. The next major turn of the wheel simply mirrored the manner in which historians were writing about Reconstruction. Once Reconstruction formally ended in the aftermath of disputed presidential election of 1876 between Rutherford Hayes and Samuel Tilden, the radical Republicans and their views quickly fell into disfavor. Historians such as William Dunning, a prominent professor at Columbia University, fostered the idea that radical Reconstruction was an unmitigated disaster that allowed a reign of terror to be unleashed against the prostrated South. Dunning had a huge impact both through his writings as well as the work of his graduate students. It was in this climate that David DeWitt published 2 very influential books, one called The Judicial Murder of Mary Surratt and The Assassination of Abraham Lincoln. DeWitt, a lawyer and Democratic politician, painted an unflattering portrait of Secretary of War Edwin Stanton and the radical Republicans. According to DeWitt, Stanton used the assassination to launch a vindictive reign of terror against the South. One innocent victim of the bloodthirsty war secretary was, according to DeWitt, was Mary Surratt, who he thought had been condemned to death on flimsy evidence. And of course, the Dunning view of Reconstruction, while it held its grip for a long period of time, is not considered to be very accurate by historians, but it has been displaced. But nonetheless, that his view persisted for quite a number of years. In the 1930s and 40s, Chicago chemist and historian Otto Eisenschimmel carried the case one step further when he hinted that not only were the radicals evil people and vindictive, but they hated Lincoln so much that they were behind his murder. Eisenschimmel used the clever technique of raising a series of provocative questions that allowed him to retreat when his critics pushed him too hard. And I always use this example. If somebody says to you, have you stopped using drugs? If you think about it, there's no good yes or no answer. Yes, I have stopped using drugs, mean you were using drugs. And, no, I haven't stopped using drugs. So it's the kind of thing that can be done with provocative questions like that. It doesn't give the respondent great room to respond to the question. Among the questions he asked were, why did General Grant not go to the theater with the Lincolns on April 14th? That seems to indicate Grant was tipped off there's danger there. You better stay away from Ford's Theater that evening. Why did the telegraph lines fail after Lincoln was shot? And how did Booth manage to escape so easily from Washington? Well, the real answers to these questions are that the Grants did not go to Ford's Theater because Mrs. Grant had experienced a recent unpleasant encounter with Mrs. Lincoln. She wasn't looking fondly on sitting in a theater box for a couple of hours with Mary Lincoln. It was only the commercial telegraph that failed, and it was shut down by its owner, who thought the Confederates might be about to seize Washington and didn't want them to seize the lines. The military lines worked perfectly, and Stanton on that evening was able to still send all kinds of telegraphs to the military around the country and inform them and what was going on and pass orders and so forth. And Booth had to boldly talk his way past armed sentries who were manning the Navy Yard bridge as he rode out of the city. And again, admittedly, it's strange. He gave his name, but he told them he was a farmer, that he'd been in Washington, and he'd been kind of celebrating, and it was late, and he wanted to get home. Occasionally, Eisenschimel admitted there were simple answers to his questions, but he had permanently planted the idea in many readers' minds that the radicals had engineered Lincoln's murder. When asked if he was saying that members of Lincoln's own cabinet were behind his death, however, Eisenschimel often replied that he only asked the questions, leaving the conclusions to be drawn by his readers. So, is that what you conclude from what I've said? I am not suggesting anything. I ask a question, but in reality, he really was trying to plant that kind of doubt in the minds of his readers. Once conspiracy charges are raised, there is no lack of authors who are ready to fill in the blanks. We lack the time here to discuss all of the conspiracy literature, which is voluminous, but many writers have gone far beyond Eisenschimel to provide definitive answers to the questions that he asked. A prime example of this trend was the 1977 book and movie, The Lincoln Conspiracy. Based on alleged newly discovered primary documents, such as missing pages from Booth's diary, the Lincoln Conspiracy attempted to prove that the case against the radicals was airtight. The Lincoln Conspiracy also raised the often repeated but thoroughly discredited claim that Booth survived Garrett's ban and someone else died in his place. One should never underestimate the effect of sensational movies and cheaply priced paperbacks, which probably reach a far wider audience than any historian can ever hope to influence. And the Lincoln Conspiracy, I think it was one of the top grossing films in the year it came out. It did not receive any nominations for any great awards, but it made plenty of money at the box office. And I think the paperback sold well. It came out in a day when paperbacks didn't sell for too much money, but nonetheless, for its day, I think it did quite well. Beginning in the 1970s and 80s, however, historians began to expose the dubious nature of much of this previous writing. Bolstered by an appreciation of the modern civil rights movement, the radical Republicans were now seen not as evil men, but advocates of such noble causes as Black voting and civil liberties. They were dedicated to that. In fact, historian Elizabeth Leonard has just released a book on Ben Butler, and as you know, who has a bad reputation, Spoon's Butler and Beast Butler and all this, trying to rehabilitate him with the idea that Butler was genuinely committed to civil rights and the rights of African Americans, and he should get a lot more credit from him. So that kind of writing, and rightfully and good, continues. Also, historians began to argue Lincoln came from that wing of the Republican Party. He was a progressive Republican. He wasn't a real conservative Republican. Now, not as radical as some, admittedly, but it does undercut the radicals' alleged motive for his murder. If he wasn't so, conservative, then why did they think they had to eliminate him? Parenthetically, there have been a number of other dubious conspiracy theories which have been long-lived. One of these is the idea that the Lincoln assassination was a Catholic plot. Since Mary Surratt was a devout Catholic, and John Surratt escaped capture, as I say, he was tried in 1867, but he escaped capture for 2 years. He fled to Italy and served in the Papal Guards at Veroli before being arrested and turned to face trial. Many people began to argue that all of the plotters were Catholics and the church was behind Lincoln's death. This actually included a member of the military commission, General Thomas M. Harris. Thomas Harris wrote a book about his experience being on the commission. So one of the commissioners believe that. And there's actually a historian to this day, Paul Mellon, recently, who's revived that claim. In fact, Paul Mellon believes that John Surratt shot Abraham Lincoln and not Booth. So you can see conspiracies here often don't die. There was also a former Catholic priest, Father Charles Chiniquy, who actually knew Lincoln, who also believed in this. And as I say, all of this is nonsense. But what is really startling is that a lot of these anti-Catholic books and tracts are still in print, and their publishers apparently are still trying to convince Americans, and some Americans in the 21st century, that the Catholic Church murdered Lincoln. In the 1980s, academic historians began to turn their attention to the assassination. They had abandoned the field to the sensationalists and popularizers previously. And I remember one time being at a historical convention where I was speaking, and I did a thing on the assassination. There were a couple of other historians of Lincoln, and they said to me afterwards, "Oh, we're glad you write on the assassination. We stay away from that. There's just so much conspiracy literature and all these types of things." One of the first historians to demolish Eisenschimmel's conspiracy charges was the historian William Hanchett. And he wrote a book called The Lincoln Murder Conspiracies. And my own book, Beware the People Weeping, in fact, my book on the assassination was the first book by an academic historian on Lincoln's assassination. It's hard to believe that, but it's true. And I'm not saying you have to be an academic. There were some good books written beforehand, despite the conspiracy things. But again, academic historians often did shy away from it. And as I say, Beware the People Weeping, I argue that the assassination had long been viewed as an isolated event, and that could only be properly understood in the context of its own times. Lincoln's death was not a simple murder mystery, but an event that was the climax to a bloody civil war. And it really needs, I think, to be understood that way. Ironically, just as the views of Hanchett, myself, and others seem to be gaining consensus, William Tidwell, James Hall, and David Gaddy brought the wheel full circle with their allegations that Jefferson Davis and the Confederates actually were responsible for attempts to capture and murder Lincoln. Specifically, they believed that the so-called Kilpatrick Dahlgren raid against Richmond in March of 1864 was set in motion by Lincoln to capture or kill Jefferson Davis. And just quickly, on Dahlgren's body, there were found papers, and there's been a big dispute over time whether these were genuine or forged or whatever, but saying that what Dahlgren, the raider, was intending to do was to dash into Richmond, capture or kill Jeff Davis and his cabinet. So the finding of this, then, the raid was unsuccessful. Dahlgren's dead, but the argument is that while Jefferson Davis had previously turned down plans to kidnap Lincoln, and there were people who came to Davis and said, I'd like to capture Lincoln, which was legal, by the way, at the time under the rules of war. But he had turned it down on the grounds that Lincoln might resist and be injured or even killed. Now it's argued by come retribution authors that the Confederate president, in retaliation for this, authored plans to capture Lincoln, including the plot developed by Booth. Finally, in the spring of 1865, with the Confederacy facing defeat, Torpedo Bureau officer Captain Thomas Harney was supposedly dispatched to blow up Lincoln and his cabinet while they were meeting in a desperate attempt to wreak havoc on the Union governmental structure. Harney, however, was captured before he could even get to Washington. And Booth decided to duplicate the plot as best he could by murdering several high-ranking officials. If the thesis of these historians is valid, then Americans in 1865 had the correct view about Lincoln's death all along. The thesis of come retribution is too complex to be thoroughly discussed in this brief presentation, but I would say that a couple of basic themes emerge. One is a dispute about methodology. Given their own intelligence backgrounds, and they all worked in government intelligence of one sort or another, Tidwell, Hall, and Gaddy claimed that they immediately recognized that attempts to capture Lincoln and ultimately assassinate him were the result of Confederate intelligence operations, although Booth was not sent directly by the Confederate government on April 14, 1865. Rather, Booth, whom the Confederates had backed in a plan to capture the president, was aware of the Harney plot, but when that failed, he duplicated the plot as best he could. Since they were convinced that their thesis was absolutely correct, they amassed evidence to support it. To be fair, they admit that their evidence is circumstantial, but they believe that it's so overwhelming that it definitively makes the case. And sometimes in a situation like that, when you're very sure that your thesis is right and people start attacking it, you become even more adamant, and perhaps circumstantial evidence becomes cited as being more substantive evidence. Now, while a new methodology and fresh approach can sometimes yield productive results, some critics pointed out that the historical method is usually deductive rather than inductive. The historian starts with collecting basic evidence, which is then analyzed to determine what conclusions emerge. Otherwise, there is a danger of simply collecting evidence to support a conclusion that you reach before you ever began any research. And as I've just said, they claim that they recognized right away from their own intelligence backgrounds that this was an intelligence operation. The following example illustrates the difference approach between Tidwell and his critics. Confederate agent Robert Cox, who had a home in St. Catharines, Canada, moved his family back to Poughkeepsie, New York, where he had previously lived in October 1864. Since Booth was at the same time in Newburgh, New York, some 14 miles away, the authors conclude that there must have been a meeting between the two men. The authors see this as important proof of Booth's contact with Confederate agents, while skeptics argue there is no concrete proof that they met or if they did what they might have discussed. Come retribution also raises major issues about the level of violence during the Civil War. Admittedly, there was a time when some authors played up the glorious aspects of the Civil War, ignoring just how destructive the conflict was. No responsible historian today would ignore events like the brutality of guerrilla warfare, massacres such as the one at Fort Pillow in Tennessee, where a lot of African American soldiers were massacred, and a lot of white soldiers as well, or the mistreatment of prisoners on both sides. Two of our major Civil War historians, both Pulitzer Prize winners, James McPherson and Mark Neely, have long debated whether the Civil War was a modern and total war, with McPherson arguing it was, and Neely viewing it as very much in the tradition of previous wars. It is still not entirely clear that the Civil War reached a level where the highest echelons on both sides were attempting to kill each other's president. In any case, the proponents of the idea that Confederate intelligence had played a leading role in Lincoln's death were at first surprised and then dismayed when their solution to the Lincoln assassination did not achieve the wide consensus that they believed it deserved. Since they felt the evidence was so overwhelming, they seemed taken aback that not all scholars were quick to accept their conclusions. And I have to admit that I was one who did not accept the conclusions, and we got into some rather heated debates occasionally places as to why I couldn't see the truth and wisdom of their argument. This is not to say that come retribution lacks supporters. William Hanchett embraced the author's thesis, as did Edward Steers in his highly regarded Blood on the Moon, albeit in a slightly more nuanced manner. Following Tidwell, Hall, and Gaddy, Steers argues that Booth had many well documented dealings with the Confederate Secret Service in Canada, which he feels at a minimum must have been aware of his capture plan and were very likely actively supporting it. Steers, however, admits that a direct link to the Confederate government in Richmond is much more tenuous and more difficult to prove. In 2004, however, Michael Kaufman's equally acclaimed book, American Brutus, a book about John Wilkes Booth, nudged the wheel in a different direction, arguing just as vigorously that Lincoln's murder was a simpler plot. Clever actor Booth openly met with those he tried to induce to join his group, such as fellow actor Samuel Knapp Chester, so that if those approached failed to sign on, they would not be able to run to the authorities for fear of implicating themselves. In a similar manner, he believes that Booth openly consorted with Confederate agents in Canada in an attempt to imply Confederate support for what he was doing, whether he really had such backing or not. Using a computer database, Kaufman also argues that most of the conspirators' business was actually conducted in stables where they kept their horses, making Mrs. Surratt's boarding house much less of a focus. Kaufman takes his readers back to a much simpler conspiracy between Booth and his co-conspirators, and the Kilpatrick Dahlgren raid, which was featured so prominently in Come Retribution, does not even appear in his index. Another recent Booth biography by well-known historian Terry Alford, called Fortune's Fool, it's been highly praised. I think it's a standard Booth biography for now. I think it might stand for a long, long time. Terry Alford found no evidence of Booth's alleged Confederate connections. I always kind of smile at Terry's biography, too. I think Booth was 26 when he was killed. Terry said it took him longer to write the life of Booth than it did for Booth to live it. But the wait was worth it. It's really a great book. I recommend it. Despite the substantial work of a number of serious scholars, regrettably, conspiracy theories which plague assassination scholarship have also refused to die. Two fairly recent examples are Dark Union by Ray Neff and Leonard Guttridge, and Murdering Mr. Lincoln by Charles Hyam. Neff and Guttridge revived the claim, sorry for that, by the Lincoln conspiracy that Stanton and Lafayette Baker were behind the murder and that Booth escaped to India. Hyam suggests that Lincoln was involved in cotton speculation, which ultimately caused his death when the speculators no longer required his services. More recently, Bill O'Reilly, in his runaway bestseller, Killing Lincoln, which remained #1 on the New York Times bestseller list for well over a year, revived Eisenschimmel's hint that Stanton might have been involved in the assassination when he asked why the plotters had not thought to eliminate the powerful war secretary. Why didn't Stanton become a target here? He ultimately concluded that Stanton probably was not involved, but like Eisenschimmel, to raise the issue is to plant serious doubt. O'Reilly's book has been read by millions of Americans and is very likely the only book that many people have read about Lincoln's death, giving it enormous power and influence. I will tell you, he does cite my work in his bibliography, which I guess I should be flattered by, although maybe there are times when somebody claims things that you don't want your work cited, to say that you favor certain things that you don't. Although there's no way to predict where the wheel might turn in the future, it is possible to suggest a couple of areas of inquiry. One of these might be a comparative studies of American assassinations. For example, when Jack Ruby shot Lee Harvey Oswald, many Americans concluded that his action was part of a major conspiracy to eliminate Oswald and prevent him from exposing other plotters, even though Ruby said he killed Oswald because he was extremely upset by Kennedy's death and wanted to spare Jacqueline Kennedy from having to return to Dallas to testify. What is not so well remembered are two attempts to kill Charles Guiteau, who assassinated James Garfield, including one by a guard who fired into his jail cell. This seems to indicate that some individuals can be angry enough to kill an assassin without a sinister conspiracy necessarily being involved. Similar comparisons might shed further light on other assassinations, including that of Lincoln. Another possible potential area of investigation might be to examine Lincoln's death in the broader context of other Civil War violence, such as Bleeding Kansas, the caning of Senator Charles Sumner, or Reconstruction violence in cities such as New Orleans. Such research could ultimately prove to be more productive than attempting to solve murders that occurred so long ago that they will probably never be completely explained to everyone's satisfaction. In the end, those who seek to understand the Lincoln assassination are still faced with a number of obstacles. Despite the progress that has been made by historians, must come to grips with the fact that 150 years after Lincoln's murder, there may be information that can never be recovered. Every successful presidential assassin was either killed or tried relatively quickly and executed. Only Booth and Oswald knew the full extent of their plans. And one of the reasons they are surrounded by conspiracy theories is that they did not leave to tell their version of what happened. If there are still any secrets about John Wilkes Booth, they may well have gone to the grave with him when he was shot and killed by Boston Corbett. Now, in 2015, and really, we almost every year we did it, but I specifically remember that year because it was the sesquicentennial year. I was actually vice chair of the Civil War sesquicentennial. I've already said tonight, Al's brother Dave was on the committee, and Dexter was very active in organizing the return of the flags, which kind of was really great at the end, finishing up there. But at this point in time, it 8 years later, it's very difficult to determine if one should be optimistic or pessimistic about the state of assassination studies and the direction they may take in the future. If there is validity in viewing assassination scholarship as a wheel, then it seems logical to assume that the wheel will continue to turn as it has done for the past 150 years. However, one must remember that wheels are neutral. They make no moral judgments about where they land. If the past is indeed prologue, new research may move investigators closer to a more correct understanding of Lincoln's assassination, but unfortunately, there is no guarantee that the wheel won't just as easily return to conspiracy theories, which have long since been discredited.